Well, hello Fiber Fam, and greetings from my studio for this week. I apologize for the mess, but it really has been a week, so this is where we're at. We're going to do tuck stitch today, and again, it's manual tuck stitch, so we're not using a punch card, just putting the needles in the position they need to be in order to do a tuck, so that you can just really experiment with pattern and design, etc. So let's get started. I'm just going to show you my carriage setup. So, Russell levers, they're going to be both of them set to 1. My cam dial is set to tuck or T depending on your machine, and then my side levers are up in the triangle position. You can also see this is a pre-owned machine, and whoever had it before me put these really helpful little notes up for themselves. It's a really great idea. Okay. Readjust here. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm just going to give my stitches a little bit of room to breathe so you can see what they're doing. So I'm going to, all of the stitches that I want to be a tuck, and I'll explain more what that is in a second once you've seen some, I'm going to put them in D position, and then B position will knit as normal. Let's raise this up a little bit. There we go. Okay, so I'm threaded like regular and everything else. My carriage settings are side levers at triangle, Russell levers at 1, cam dial to tuck or T. And again, if you're using a punch card, that might be different, but we're doing it manually, so that's what works. So I'm going to knit across, and it's going to take a second to show you what's happening. So you can see that all of the needles that are in B position, they knit normally. Fix that guy. My yarn is a little bit sticky tonight, so I might have to fuss a bit. But all the ones that are in D, the yarn, instead of knitting in, it's just floating on top of the needle, okay? Now, I'm going to leave my camera here. I'm going to knit across again. And you can see these needles did not move at all, and there's another float carried on top of the needle. Do it one more time. So again, now if I look really closely, I can see there are 1, 2, 3 little floats of yarn sitting on top of that needle, and I kind of yanked my needles when I was doing that, so I just got to reset them. There we go. Okay, now if what I want to do is I want to set them back as regular stitches. There we go. So I'm just going to take these needles and I'm going to put them back just slightly towards the back of my needle bed. And I'll show you that. So you can see they're not all the way out in D, but I didn't pull them all the way back to B either. I just, like a centimeter is all I bring them back by. The reason I do that, because they're all the way out, the yarn is behind the little latches now, and so if I push them like just all the way back to B to knit again, when I bring the carriage across, this little latch, it's going to get closed before it can get a yarn into the hook here, the new yarn, which is going to drop my stitches. So if you have that issue, anytime you are pushing your needles out to D and then bringing them back into working position, if they're just dropping stitches, chances are you're bringing them too far back. I only ever bring them back a centimeter. Okay, now I'm going to knit across. Oh, and I didn't bring that one back far enough because I was demonstrating with it. Okay. I'll push it back all the way out. So you can see, it's probably the easiest one to see by, what this tuck stitch does. So the stitch that was tucked is this one here that's been elongated. So I knit 3 rows, and that one didn't get a new stitch made into it. So it basically got pulled from the row 3 behind, 3 rows ago, and then only got knit after 4 passes. So it's basically kind of skipping 3 rows of knitting, so it's a bit of a stretched, elongated stitch. And then those floats that were sitting on top of the needle, when this gets knit in, they sit around the neck of that stitch. And so on the purl side of the cloth, it actually creates this sort of beautiful little butterfly shape. And on the front side of the cloth, it creates this stretched, elongated stitch. But also, you can imagine, the more of these I have beside one another, they can sort of pinch or pucker the cloth on the knit face. Generally speaking, with tuck stitch, the purl side is used as the face, but not always, whatever you like. So, you do have to be careful, depending on the type of yarn you're using, your gauge, all that stuff. There's a maximum to how many passes you can make. I tend to stick to 5 as a maximum. If you're using really fine yarns and a loose gauge, you can definitely fit more passes into the stitch, like the machine can physically do it, but if they're stretched too far, it stops holding them in that pretty little butterfly, and they start to kind of just, they like loosen up and spread out. It's not as well defined. But as always, whatever you think you're interested in, just experiment with it and see what you like, right? For those of you in my class at the college, 4 or 5 is definitely the max if you're working on our machines. And that's just when you start working with more passes before creating the actual tuck stitch, you can build up too much yarn and then the machine has a really hard time getting it through the stitch. And so that can be tough on the machine. So we want to avoid that. Okay. So with tuck stitch, you can, do tuck in the same places. You can stagger it. You can do it where it's just like 1 row, and then you put it back in a working position, and 1 row and back in a working position. Really, like, just play around with it. So again, I put the needles I want to tuck out into D. I knit, and then I bring them back just a little bit. Knit across. So when they're in tuck, that needle that's all the way out is not being knit. As I make passes with the machine, the yarn floats are being held on top of the needle, and then they get caught in that new stitch. They don't show on the front of the cloth, they're just caught in behind. And this is a big difference. Slip stitch is fairly similar to tuck, except that these floats, instead of being caught up here, they're just carried across the back. So it does have a different look. Now, the other thing about it, so you can see, this is kind of building up, it's very pretty. You can create like honeycombed cloth, lots of texture. The thing about it that you have to remember and you have to keep in mind is when I'm doing a tuck stitch, what I cannot do is have 2 needles in tuck position beside one another, or 3 or 5 or 6 or whatever. You always have to have at least 1 knit stitch next to a tuck before. You have to have at least 1 knit stitch in between a tuck stitch and the next tuck stitch in order for the stitch to have integrity and to work. So I said you have to have a knit beside a tuck, and then I kind of corrected myself because you can do other things beside your tuck stitch. Like I love doing tuck lace where I put ladders on either side of my tuck stitches, and then it just creates a more open cloth. It's really beautiful, and it really emphasizes and exaggerates the tuck notes. But before I do another ladder and tuck grouping, I have to have at least 1 knit stitch. So I can do knit stitch, ladder, tuck, ladder, knit stitch, ladder, tuck. That's totally fine. I can do knit stitch, ladder, 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 tuck, ladder, 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 knit stitch, ladder, ladder, tuck, right? But I have to have a knit stitch before I get to another tuck. That's really it. We'll go over sort of more techniques in class. You can also do interesting things where you can play with color. So if I were to put my needles in tuck and then switch color, it's going to carry the contrast color from the row below up into the new color I switched to, so you get sort of like a vertical striping line. So yeah, play around with it. I love it. I think it doesn't get its due for sure. So it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Just keep in mind you can't have too many floats or your machine might not be able to make the stitch, or they sort of start to lose that definition, and you always have to have at least one knit stitch in between two tuck stitches in order for it to have any integrity. Yeah, that's it. Enjoy.